Last week, hopefully you were able to watch the documentary. I'm hoping that it was still accessible. Looking at colonial Mexico, and remember that this is a Chicano studies class, so our focus is really in the American Southwest. At least that's what we call it today. So we spent a few weeks looking at Spain and Mexico, but now we're moving north because that's the subject that we're covering. So the video that hopefully you watch focuses on colonial Mexico, and during that colonial period you begin to see people migrate from Mexico to different parts of what is today California, Texas, and New Mexico. The readings address this, right? This kind of movement north. So this movement, normally the way it's presented, it's kind of perceived in a way that's very romanticized. If you ever go places like Santa Barbara, you have the mission system, and they always represented it as almost like a Disneyland type of history where Native Americans wanted to be converted to Catholicism, and everybody kind of gets along with everybody, and the people that were there were caballeros, typically white. And well, when we look at the history, we see that it's further from the truth, right? That never really existed. So we're going to address this movement north to places like California. The reading, I think, focuses on Texas. But when people begin to move to places like California, and California just tends to be the most populous state, even though it's not heavily populated, during this movement, we find that first it's the missions that begin to move north, and they actually get a lot of land from the Spanish government to settle different parts of California. This is why you have these kind of missions up and down the state, if you ever had a chance to go to them, right? So they're there to serve a religious purpose, which is to convert people who are there. This is part of the Jesuit movement. And if you know anything about the Reformation, the Jesuits, who are Catholic, had a very kind of militaristic model when it came to conversion. So they kind of forced people to convert. And some of the stories of what happened in the missions are quite horrific. But the missions don't move to places like Santa Barbara or San Luis Obispo on their own. They need protection because they're just religious leaders. So the military, the Spanish military, also moves up there with them. And in a place like Santa Barbara, I actually went to school in Santa Barbara, which is why I know it so well. But in a place like Santa Barbara, you have the mission, which you see here, and then maybe a couple miles down, you see the Presidio. The Presidio is basically a military post, maybe a mile down the street from the mission's at, maybe a mile and a half, down State Street, if you've ever been there. You see the Presidio. And what we find that throughout California and Texas and even Arizona and New Mexico, these populations tend to be fairly small. The majority of people that migrate tend to be single men. And this is important because of the horrific things that happen to the native people in places like California. There's a great article by Antonia Castañeda that talks about basically the rape of Native American women, and it had to do with many of these men who move up there and just begin to attack all these women. If you ever get a chance to take my women's history class, we cover that subject. So the people that move up there, as I mentioned earlier, right, many of them are Jesuit friars, part of the religious institutions, but then you also have these people who are not the best group of people, at least some of them. You have criminals, you have a lot of convicts, you just have a bunch of people who are just kind of traveling. Understand that history later changes, particularly when Americans begin to take over California. They begin to present these people as caballeros, what they used to call la gente de razón, to kind of elevate them from different people. And the reason why they do this is to kind of whitewash the history of what took place here. But yeah, I mean, we Americans are the same thing. We descend from criminals and convicts, right? If you ever look at American history, we always kind of present it as though we descend from pilgrims and Puritans who are fighting religious freedom. It's like, no, we descend from, criminals and prostitutes and things like that. Because these are the people who were kind of sent off into some of these locations to get rid of them, right? So England was trying to get rid of its certain population, and it sent them to the colonies. And Mexico's trying to get rid of a certain population. Or not Mexico, but New Spain is sending them to California. And, it is a very hard life. Some of them were criminals, and they were asked, do you want to serve time in Mexico, or sorry, in New Spain, kind of central Mexico, or do you want to kind of risk it and move up here? And there's, you had a 50-50 chance of you could possibly die living in places like Los Angeles and so forth. And what we find in places like California is that Mexico, the United States has a very kind of rigid racial system, right? A white-black kind of rigid racial system. But Mexico has one too, where you have, and you saw that in the video, hopefully, they call it castas, right? Where depending on the color of your skin, you have certain privileges in Mexican territory. So, Mexico does have its racial problems. But unlike America, where it only has two, Mexico has like 16 or might be 30. I can't remember. It's been a long time since I looked at this. So there's more mobility there, partly because there's a lot more racial mixing, whereas in America, we really try to limit that. But what we find in places like California is that many of these people who were mestizos or some of the other racial categories that that the video talked about, is that society was a little bit more open. They had more opportunities. So for some, it made sense to move from Mexico, or what is now Mexico, to places like California and Texas, because they could have had better opportunities and not be discriminated as much based on their skin tone. So the castas were not as stringent in these locations. So what we find is that many of the people who settled California were mestizos. And they were not those kind of white Spanish caballeros that the Americans kind of create in the 1880s, 1890s to kind of whitewash this history. So California at this time, it's not heavily populated. So Mexico, or New Spain, because it's not Mexico quite yet, but New Spain kind of sends people up there, again, some of these convicts, and it's only a handful of people that decide to go up there. I mean, there's not much going on that would really gravitate a lot of people to move to California. I mean, today it's quite different, right? There's a reason to move to California, maybe just to escape this heat. But back then, not so much, right? These are small little towns, a couple thousand people, as you can kind of see there. In Southern California, only about 1,800 people lived down there before the 1800s. One of the biggest cities at this time was this city. Just to give you the full name, is El Pueblo de Nuestra Señora la Reina de los Ángeles de Porciúncula, and all that means is Los Angeles, right? So LA was just a small little town at that time, maybe like the city of Buckeye, right? Maybe like Old Buckeye or something. It's very, very small. And many of the new Spanish government offered people to move to places like California, and they offered them mules, land, horses, cattle. They paid for the transportation costs, whatever it took to move people up there, because nobody wanted to go up there. And the reason they were doing this is to create somewhat of a buffer zone between, New Spain and some of these other encroaching powers, such as the United States, that were moving west. Many of them, and I used to maybe put this word in quotes, married, because unfortunately many of these women were raped. So many of these, again, convicts and so forth, right? These soldiers who moved to Northern California, or to California, were raping some of these women, and the church said, well, if you marry them, not only will, can you have them as your wife, but you can also, we'll also give you all this kind of stuff, right? So they try to limit the rape of Native American women by kind of forcing these men to marry them. It's a quite tragic story as to what happens, but this is why you see such a kind of mixed group of people in these regions. And by the 1800s, as we get closer to the 1800s, as I said earlier, it's the church who first moves up here. They get all the land. Well, the state eventually takes away some of this church land and distributes it, right, to some of these people who decide to move north. So that's what this means, the secularization of ecclesiastical property. So just in Southern California, they take about 14 million acres and they give it to different people. So they partition it out. And this is a very kind of generic map of Los Angeles. But it's kind of helpful because you see certain names that are still there today. So this would have been part of this kind of land grant movement that was happening in the late 1700s, early 1800s, where certain families own hundreds of acres. And some of these names still resonate. So if you're from Los Angeles, you probably have heard of Los Cerritos, right? And San Pedro, obviously, these places are still there. San Gabriel Valley or something like that. I can't remember what it's called. So some of these locations are still there. La Brea, that's still there, right? And what we see is that some of these convicts, who were again convicts and criminals, all of a sudden became property owners, and they became important people in California. And you see here, this is, if you're from LA, you probably heard this name, such as Pico Rivera, right? And this is Pio Pico. So there he is. And as you can kind of see his facial features, he's very racially mixed. He looks a little bit Native American, but he also looks African American, but he also has maybe Spanish, what we would call Spanish blood in him. So he's a mestizo. So in Mexico, in central Mexico, he probably would have been a nobody, but now that he's able to, because of the casta system, but now that he's able to move north, right, now that he's kind of settled in California, he actually becomes the governor of California. He owns a few hotels. So if you ever go to Placita Alvera, there's a building, historical building there, and that used to be his hotel down there. So you have what's called this rancho aristocracy, what they call hidalgos, right? These people who were once criminals now owned all this territory, and some of them were given a lot of land. Now the problem with all this land that they were given is that the reading talks about this, how Mexicans tend to be very communal, right? That even though they have these large parcels of land, they kind of share things. And what we find is that a lot of them didn't take good property records, where some of the boundaries between territories were just kind of geographical ideas, like, you see those mountains and you see that river and all that type of stuff, right? Kind of defined these boundaries of their property. So they were so vague, and at this time it was not a big deal because there's nobody living in these places. But as we move to 1848, all of a sudden this becomes very important. So, but they own so much of it, right? 11 leagues, that's quite a lot of land. We find that it kind of goes with everything, right? Small percentage of the population controls the majority of the land. But we find that, it is open to different groups of people. And we see one example where women are able to own land. So just to give you one example, Doña Juana Pacheco owned about 17,000 acres. So that's quite significant. So this was once where we lived, part of Mexico. It was Mexico's, Spain's territory, but also Mexico's territory. And eventually things begin to change, even though they're controlling it. As Americans begin to move in, things begin to change, and that's where we'll pick up this conversation next.